you know, there's a lot going on underneath the hood here of different instructions, but the basic instructions are relatively simple. We asked Guidehouse to develop pathways in BC to achieve an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. That's the objective function of the report, okay? Get to that legislated target. To do so, we then asked them, find a couple different ways to get there. Develop a straw dog of this, you know, electrify everything approach, how it would work here in BC. And then develop, you know, there's lots of different kind of scenarios and different iterations of all this, but then, you know, we kind of landed into two central scenarios, which was, and then develop what we call a diversified scenario. And the instruction there was more or less keep the load on the gas system the same in 2050 as it is today. So just mimic what a still healthy gas utility could be in 2050, but importantly, still hit that 80% greenhouse gas reduction, still hit the objective function, okay? And then, you know, do all the standard stuff, you know, evaluate all this, you know, through the BAT computer, spit it all out, tell us all about the reductions, the cost, the impacts to consumers. Let's kind of pry this open and discuss. Okay, so that's going into the presentation. And now I would pass it over to Andrea. She can make
Thanks, Tyler. So I think one additional context that I would add on the two pathways from a direction perspective was that both are aligned with the Clean BC plan. And so the Clean BC plan provides a lot of the initiatives that occur, but only out to 2030. And so up to that time, the pathways are more similar than they are afterwards. This slide outlines at a high level what some of the differences, key differences between the pathways are. One thing I'll say from a context perspective is that we did model primarily initiatives or type of activities that are technically feasible currently. And so the idea is that we haven't really modeled too much innovation. So that's something to keep in mind as we go through the presentation, as we look at the differences between the two. On the energy efficiency perspective, both pathways include a significant amount of energy efficiency and a similar level of energy efficiency. The key difference is that the diversified pathway also incorporates gas heat pumps in a really big way. That's one of the more nascent or newer technologies that we did model in the two pathways. From a fuel switching perspective, the electrification, like electrify everything kind of pathway, as Tyler described it, is really looking at just that. It's electric heat pumps for all of the buildings, heat and water systems. We understand there are technical issues with it, and I think in both pathways, the idea was not necessarily to model what a realistic future pathway might be, but to model two alternatives or two sort of extremes. And then on the fuel switching side, there is still fuel switching in the diversified pathway, and that's important because the diversified pathway is not a pathway where we're saying that there is no electrification. There's still actually significant electrification in that diversified pathway. There's just not as much as there is in the electrification pathway. Transportation is a great example of that. The Clean BC plan includes 100% of light-duty vehicles moving to EVs, and that's modeled in both pathways. So there's significant electrification there, but then the difference is that in the electrification pathway, we're looking at a bigger role for medium and heavy duty on electric vehicles, and in the diversified pathway, we're looking at a bigger role for natural gas in those medium and heavy duty. One of the biggest differences between the two pathways is the renewable gas that we've modeled. In the electrification pathway, we essentially model what is modeled in the Clean BC plan and don't go a lot higher than that from a renewable gas potential perspective. In the diversified pathway, you'll see in future slides that a significant amount of the gas that's currently in the system is displaced by renewable gas or low carbon gas, and that includes both RNG and hydrogen. So we can flip to the next slide, I think, Tyler. This is just demonstrating that both of the pathways achieve nearly what's required by 2050. And this is where I want to mention again that we did incorporate some newer technologies, but we didn't really assume that a lot of innovation would happen. So the assumption here is that by 2050, you're going to be able to achieve the reductions that are required just because there'll be innovation that will help you, new technologies that will help you get there. One important note on this slide is just that we did exclude from both the reference case and from the actual pathways the emissions that are associated with the exports from the oil and gas sector. I think we discussed internally whether or not we should, and I think that it's a more political issue in terms of what's happening with those emissions and how they're actually impacting globally reductions, which was too challenging to model at this point. Tyler, I'm going to pass it back to you for your favorite slide on the heating loads, and can walk folks through that.
Yes. So this is one of my favorite slides. Yes, and it describes what I was getting into a bit earlier, which is this challenge of peak heat, or the challenge of meeting the heating load in this province with decarbonized energy, no matter what you're doing. Okay, and so let me just walk you through what's going on. A lot of lines on this plate of spaghetti here, but let me just walk you through what's going on, and then we can kind of summarize. So this chart basically shows a day in the life of FortisBC and BC Hydro. This shows hourly throughput on our system for the following days below. So if we just start from the bottom there on that green line, this shows what a typical summer day is for FortisBC's throughput. I apologize to my American colleagues. This is in metric units, or so this is terajoules per hour. I actually don't know I know it's basically the same as BTUs, but I don't know how many M's are in front of that BTU to convert that. So essentially, though, this is about 10 terajoules an hour is being flowed through our system on a summer day. What is this? It's essentially water heaters and industrial applications for natural gas. I've converted that 10 terajoules over to a electric capacity equivalent. So how much generating capacity would you need to produce that much energy? That's just a one-to-one energy conversion basis. But so 10 terajoules, more or less 3,000 megawatts equivalent, okay? Then we go up to a typical winter day. This is sometime in November 2019 on FortisBC system. This is all real data, by the way. And there you see that, we are now 3.5 times greater than a typical summer day. So people have their furnaces on, people have their heaters on, their combi systems, whatever else. And then we're basically delivering, about between 8 and 10,000 megawatts worth of electric generating capacity. You then go up to our coldest day in 2019, which I believe was January 17th, 2019. And then again, we're an extra 25% more throughput going through the system at that time. And then critically, we're delivering more energy than what the electric utility has available on its, basically in terms of its capacity limitations. So that solid line is now above the dotted lines. And there we are delivering, anywhere between 12 and 14,000 megawatts equivalent. So, right there, the gas system is basically dealing with this incredibly peaky and immense load shape. And the gas system is essentially designed operationally and financially to deal with these types of peaks. So the gas system delivers the vast majority of its energy over, a quarter of the year, a third of the year, and it's financially designed by which to do so, also operationally speaking. So wow, we're already delivering more than BC Hydro has available. It's 5 times more than what our base load is. It's an extra 25% more than what a typical winter day is. And then lo and behold, I don't know if anybody remembers, well, actually, I don't particularly know if most people are calling in from the PNW, if there was that cold snap breached all the way down the coast there, but there was back in January 14th of 2020. That feels like it was 5 years ago, frankly, but if you can harken back and remember, back in January of this year, we had a very cold snap, at least in the lower mainland of British Columbia, where it got to about -9 degrees centigrade. That wasn't a record load on our system, but I think it was the second highest daily load that we've had on our system. And there again, we've bumped up again to another 30-40% above the previous winter peak. So there's still already this incredible capacity to reach above what is a typical normal peak. And we're at, close to 18,000 megawatts. Okay, so why am I belaboring this point? It's actually a simple point. The gas system is delivering extremely large quantities of energy to serve heating loads when it is called upon to do so in this province. And if we are to decarbonize this load, then we have essentially a very large problem on our hands. If we are going to electrify it, you can kind of see the implications there of just how large that load shape is. Or, you know, if we're going to use low carbon gases, we still need to meet this peak. And so, so with that, the major challenges that we find for decarbonization in this province, I think one of the major challenges orbits this issue, which is how do we address this peaky nature of the heat load in this province. And so what I'd like to refer to is both pathways, the electrification and the diversified pathway, have a critical feasibility hurdle, an eye-watering challenge, essentially, as I like to call it, which is, and on the electrification side, the challenge is this, is were we to choose an electrify everything approach that electrifies a lot of building end uses and transportation end uses, then we would need an incremental almost 9,000 megawatts of new firm clean electricity capacity. So there are laws and regulations here in BC that require that BC Hydro or our electric utility maintains a high clean threshold. You know, it's not an option necessarily to build new thermal capacity in this province. So a lot of options, a lot of resource options are off the table, and the remaining options are kind of not great. So they're expensive, and they need to be basically, they need to deliver energy when we need. So, you know, as we like to think about in the utility business, your system is only as good as the day you really need it. And as a utility with a duty to serve, for an essential end use as something like heat, which can be a security issue for people, a health and safety issue for people, you know, you need to provide that service. And so it's not good enough to hope that you can meet the peak, you do need to meet the peak. Still, as Andrew was saying, on the diversified pathway, it's still a lot of electrification is happening in this pathway as well. We need almost 5,000 megawatts of new capacity, but, you know, like anything, every additional megawatt is that much more expensive in many respects, especially with this limitation on it needing to be firm. So the diversified pathway avoids essentially 4,000 additional megawatts that we would need. I'll leave it there and we'll pass it over to Andrea for the other feasibility challenge.
Thanks, Tyler. So I think basically, as Tyler was mentioning, there's a feasibility challenge in either pathway. In the electrify everything or electrification pathway, it's really that peak demand issue. And then here in the diversified pathway, you see that we're keeping essentially the same throughput of gas on the system in 2050, but we replace the majority of it with renewable natural gas and hydrogen. As Tyler said, I think that BC is one of the only provinces that has a publicly stated goal for low carbon fuels. And that's a 2030 goal, and it's already aggressive to achieve that. And then we're going ahead and adding a whole lot more renewable natural gas and hydrogen in that diversified pathway. One thing that's important to note is that we did, again, bound this based on what is technically feasible. We looked at studies specifically within the province of BC to look at what sources were available to produce renewable natural gas in that province, and that's what we base this on. It is at the top of that technical potential, but we're looking at 2050, so presumably there'll be changes to what's technically feasible by then as well. Tyler, if you don't want to add anything.
If I could just jump in there, if I could just jump in on just one more point I'd like to make is that, yes, this is a very large expansion of renewable fuels into our system. Just to give you a sense of where we're at currently as a utility, you know, this year we'll have 0.5 petajoules of renewable fuels. By the end of next year, we'll have 1 petajoule of renewable fuels. Then 2022 to 2023, we already have approved offtake agreements through our regulator for over 6 petajoules of 6 million gigajoules, 6 petajoules, if you will, of renewable fuels. And then we are working very determinedly with a bunch of different project developers. We have issued RFEOIs for renewable fuel offtake agreements, and we're confident that we can get, you know, over 20 petajoules of renewable fuels by 2025. So just to say that it's ambitious, but we're well on the trajectory right now. It's early days. We're at the early part of that asymptote to kind of ramp up, but we are kind of, we are very concertedly expanding the supply of renewable fuels in line with the trajectory that this would take.
So Andrea and Tyler, I do have a question here from Holly Braun at Northwest Natural. Andrea said the same throughput in diversification path, but wouldn't energy efficiency play a big role, or is EE energy efficiency compensating for growing populations so it's both heavy EE and the same throughput?
So if I can get myself off mute there, it's also related to changes in the transportation sector. So this is the kind of full view of gas in the economy. And so we're showing growing loads of gas use in the transportation sector, and that offsets some of the efficiency that's happening in the building side. It is offsetting also the growth in the population.
And what I'd like to say is that over the coming decades, the gas system really transitions to being a major supplier of transportation fuel in this pathway. So yes, the relative share of buildings and residential consumers in terms of our load goes down significantly over this time. That's just kind of a natural kind of autonomous generation of ever greater energy efficiency. One of the things that we like to note is, you know, 10 or 15 years ago, our usage per customer was around 120 gigajoules. Today it's 80 or 80 or 90 approximately. So that's already gone down by about a quarter. We expect that to continue. We also expect other sectors to open up to the gas system beyond our traditional consumers.
Let's move to the next slide, Tyler, if that works for folks. So
I do have one more question, Andrea. I'm sorry here. Is the assumed renewable natural gas domestic, or will Fortis compete for it in the U.S.? That's a question probably for Tyler, right?
Not to show our hand too much, this assumes this potential is is theoretically available here in BC, though we already have 6 agreements approved for RNG from outside of BC to be delivered to. So actually, we've already got our first deliveries of RNG from Ontario to BC about 3 or 4 weeks ago. So we are expecting that out of province RNG will be important. We haven't reached any agreements for anything outside of Canada. So we're looking primarily in Canada, but you know, who knows what the future holds.
All right, so we've talked a little bit about the challenges from a technical feasibility perspective of the 2 pathways. This is the view of the costs, the high-level cost view. I think one of the key findings that we had out of the study was that it's really critical to model both pathways all the way out to 2050. And so if you stop at 2030, might look like electrify everything is a better solution, but the reality is that in the long term, you'll find that diversified pathway is significantly less expensive than the electrification pathway. A lot of that is being driven by the requirement for the build out of the new generation and infrastructure that's required to support that peak demand issue, which Tyler was covering earlier. And that really starts to ramp up in 2035. So I think you'll see basically that if you take a shorter view, you may make the wrong decision, and it's critical really to make sure that you're taking that longer view, and then recognizing also that there are additional benefits beyond just the cost here of having both systems and having the resiliency that's associated with that. Tyler, did you want to add anything else on this slide?
No, I'll move on. Thanks, Andrea.
Great. So this is looking at what it looks like from a consumer perspective. So this is high-level rate modeling, not intended to be very detailed, but it's intended to show you a view of what impact the 2 pathways are going to have to consumer rates. Of course, in both cases, in order to achieve or nearly achieve the -80 reduction, there's going to be significant increases in terms of customer rates. But one of the things which is most interesting is that in the electrification pathway, you see a really big growth in one time period versus it being a more smooth growth over time. So one of the things which Tyler has pointed out when we've done this presentation in the past is what public perception would be to, an increase of 5% from 2035 to 2045 and how that would be viewed. And so I think that having that steady growth and less growth is also one of the benefits that we see to that diversified pathway.
So Andrea, I do have a question here. What are the assumptions that go in? Got to be kind of careful here for antitrust purposes, but what are the assumptions that you're using for renewable gas costs over time versus electric costs?
Sure. So we looked at the renewable gas costs. We used a number of sources. We've got some internal data points as well, but one of the primary sources was a study that was done in BC. And one of the things that you find is that as you add more renewable gas to the system, or you move past a point where you can blend hydrogen directly into the system, you have to move to methanation, you get to higher cost sources of the low carbon fuels. And that's basically reflected in the modeling that we've done here on the renewable gas side. And then on the electricity side, we did actually look at it from a conservative perspective. We looked at what the least cost clean electricity build out would be in BC and modeled that to add all of the additional generation that would be required on the system. And so we actually have modeled it based on hydroelectric, the most recent hydroelectric project that's going on in BC. But the reality is that it wouldn't likely all be hydroelectric. However, from a cost perspective, that's the most conservative cost.
Thank you.
No problem. Any other questions here?
We're good for now.
Okay. So I think we're good to move on then, Tyler, if that works for you. This is actually expanding a little bit on what I was just talking about from a perspective of the total cost of fuel switching versus just the low carbon gas and DSM. And this is showing those differences in both pathways. And so on the left, we have the cost of fuel switching and the cost of low carbon gas in the electrification pathway. And on the right, we have the same thing in the diversified pathway. Now, the reason that the cost of low carbon gas is cheaper in the electrification pathway is because we don't have to go to the more expensive sources and technologies of low carbon gas to get the amount that we're modeling in that pathway as what we see in the diversified pathway. But the key takeaway here really is that in both pathways, you'll see that a low carbon gas and DSM is much less expensive than fuel switching. It's roughly times more expensive to look at fuel switching than it is to look at low carbon gas.
Andrea, one question here. This is actually my question. You indicate that fuel switching requires significantly higher initiative system and energy costs. What are initiative costs? What's included in that bucket?
So that's actually the technology itself and then the installation basically. So from an initiative perspective for fuel switching, you'd be looking at, the actual heat pump and then the retrofitting costs of that heat pump. And then system would be the associated build out of the electricity system to support it, and energy costs, the actual electricity.
Thank you.
No problem.
If I could just jump in here. This is an area that we've been interested in because we've all seen lots of different analyses about the cost of electrification, specifically the cost of reducing emissions in the built environment. And, from my perspective, those analyses have all been really interesting and good, but I've always kind of felt like they were missing something, or that the scope was maybe just not including all of the costs. And so not to say that this is the be all end all of that type of analysis, but we really tried to kind of bake in the upstream infrastructure costs, which a lot of times are not particularly considered when looking at building electrification, or they're kind of assumed away in still low electricity rates. So if what Andrea and the team did here is they took that rate modeling and which recovered all the costs of the investment in the electricity system and brought that forward to what would be a cost per ton in 2050. And I find this to be an interesting finding, or an interesting discussion point for what that cost might be to reduce emissions in the built environment.
Question here from Kevin Dool. So electrification plus low-cost gas plus DSM is cheaper? That's the question. I also have another question from Ed Finkley. What price? Oh, we already asked that question. So electrification plus low-cost gas plus DSM is cheaper. Is that correct? And then I do want to do a time check. We're 10 minutes out from our cutoff time, so hopefully we're moving along in an appropriate pace.
We are moving along. I think we're very close. Tyler just has one closing slide. And yes, that is the key message. It isn't, it isn't that low carbon gas on its own is the way to go. It's that if you incorporate, electrification where it makes sense with low carbon gas and DSM, that's cheaper than electrification only.
Thank you.
Tyler, why don't you close us out with the last slide?
So this is the last slide. So again, thank you for your attention, folks. If I were to boil down just from the FortisBC perspective, what we learned from this presentation or from this analysis that we did with Navigant over the past year was, this is really, I guess all of these points are basically making the same point, which is that it's really not, at least in BC here, an either or type of situation, that we really need to bring all the key energy sector players to develop kind of optimal integrated strategies to achieve decarbonization in this province. Essentially what's going on is that the gas system is onboarding emission abatement intensity to take some of the costs, take some of the pressure off of the electricity system. Meanwhile, you get to keep both systems, keep the resiliency and reliability that you have from maintaining both systems at the same time. So that's an added bonus of that type of approach. So if I were to just, very quickly summarize, we really need to be focusing on optimizing solutions and in my opinion, at least, moving away from this false competition, gas versus electric. I think we have not given a very good college try yet on the renewable gas potential and on really actually going there. One of the points I'd like to make is that, 25 years ago, there was, 800 megawatts of solar PV installed, and today there's 800 megawatts of hydrogen electrolyzer capacity installed. So we're 25 years later on, but that does not mean that there isn't already significant potential for the gas system to also reduce emissions with renewable gas. So finally, just to plug FortisBC, we are basically going there. We're investing heavily in trying to uncover these options. We recently were approved for a $25 million ratepayer funded innovation fund that we will be putting over the next 5 years to innovative solutions along the entire spectrum of options that might reduce emissions from the gas system. But yeah, really focusing on stuff like renewable gases and that kind of thing. So I think that, we've really just scratched the surface here. This is a first kind of shot across the bow in terms of understanding what the gas system is, but at least from this initial analysis, we're pretty excited about what could be achieved and how we can actually use the gas system to reduce overall costs of meeting our climate challenge. So thank you very much, Dan, and I guess I'll pass it over to you.
Great, thank you, Tyler and Andrea. I do have a couple questions. I think this first one is maybe for Andrea from Ed Finkley, the Alliance of Western Energy Consumers. Are new gas infrastructure costs to interconnect with renewable gas sources included in your modeling?
They are, yeah. So the cost of adding those new projects and interconnecting them is included here.
Okay. And then from Kevin Dool, Northwest Natural, this is probably for Tyler. How do you perceive that the transition affects the utility business model, Tyler? You kind of alluded to it in a couple of ways here, I think.
I guess I need to know kind of where further you're going with that. I mean, we are fortunate here in BC in that we do have a fairly expansive regulatory regime where we have been able to go and acquire renewable gases under regulated investments, just as we've been able to make investments in energy efficiency under regulated forms. I think that the business model, what we're looking to do is just continue to expand and amend that regulatory environment to continue to allow us to make these type of investments in carbon saving solutions.
So one example might be the innovation fund, where each of your customers pays 50 cents a month on their bill, and that creates a $25 million fund for you to invest in innovative technologies that, in effect, keep the gas system alive and a vibrant part of a low carbon future.
That's right. Absolutely.
I think, I don't know about anybody else on the call, but I can say I have envy over that. We'd love to see that kind of regulatory treatment down here. I have another question here from, I think, Gurvinder Singh at Puget Sound Energy. Seems like you're going to need a lot of RNG to achieve the goals in this diversified pathway. What are the sources that qualify or are assumed in this study?
That's a good question. Andrew, did you want to take that one? Or?
I don't know specifically what sources it was. We actually looked at recent studies that were done in BC for what type of sources there were. I think it was all biomass, but I don't think that we went to anything that was too nascent from a technology perspective, but Tyler, you may recall as well.
Yeah, so essentially all of I like to think about it as renewable gas version 1, 2, and 3. So version 1 is kind of the traditional anaerobic digestion. So we are ambitious in kind of realizing most or all of the potential from anaerobic digestion, from landfill gas and agricultural waste and so on and so forth. Then we also have a very sizable amount of biomass in the province, that biomass waste. So like forestry / hog fuels, biomass waste from sawmills that could be used in gasification projects. That technology is not far away. In fact, we already have an approved supply offtake agreement with a company called RenEnergy that is going to provide to us a sizable amount of renewable natural gas from biomass gasification. And so that project has just been approved earlier this year or late last year, and that'll be and that's in development currently. So just to say that we do rely a lot on this biomass waste as the second generation of renewable natural gas, and then the third generation obviously is stuff like synthesis gases and hydrogen. We're working a lot with industrial counterparts to use them essentially as host sites by which to produce and consume renewable gases. So synthesis gases that can be more readily handled in industrial applications such as kilns. And then also we're working intensively on bringing hydrogen projects together in the grid. That'll require additional regulatory change, but that's not stopping us from kind of doing a lot of the pre-development work already.
So I have another question here, this one from Alex Shea of the Northwest Alliance for Clean Transportation. So if conventional natural gas has a CI score of 80 grams per megajoule, how much can you decrease the CI score of Fortis's overall fuel mix by introducing RNG and renewable hydrogen?
Just to clarify, that's a good question. I'm not sure I have the answer off the top of my head, but here in BC, our life cycle carbon intensity of the gas in our system is just a bit south of 60 grams per megajoule. That's for various reasons. Most notably is the fact that our gas reserves are actually quite low carbon. They have low formation CO2, and we have very low methane emissions in our natural gas basin, because it's actually quite deep. It's very dissimilar from much of the unconventional gas reserves in the United States. But how low does the carbon intensity go? I believe, Andrea, that it goes down to around 15 grams per megajoule in the system, although I don't have that number right at the top of my head.
Yeah, I also don't have it at the top of my head. We can provide that as follow-up if folks are interested.
Okay, well, I have no more questions and we're out of time, even if I did. So once again, I want to thank Tyler and Andrea, great presentation. And for the folks listening, good questions. Appreciate your engagement in our monthly webinar. And with that, I'll just note, stay tuned for notice on the October 22nd webinar, which we hope to feature some innovations in natural gas technologies, especially on the renewable natural gas side. So kind of a nice segue really from this presentation where Fortis is telling us that we need to rely on a lot of renewable natural gas in our systems across this region if we're going to be contributors to a significantly decarbonized economy. And then to be able to kind of focus a little bit on renewable natural gas innovations that are going to help us meet those objectives and achieve the volumes that we need to be a part of that decarbonized future. So with that, stay tuned. We'll get notice out as soon as we have that confirmed. And I will wish you all, hopefully, free breathing as much as possible, clearer skies or blue skies, nothing but blue skies. And then we look forward to visiting with you again in October. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye now.
Bye.